Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning. I want to say a special good morning and welcome also to the Year 4 class from Georgetown Primary and their teachers. Thank you all for coming. I hope that your experience here is something that you will find helpful and useful as you learn more about civics and the way government works. Mr. Speaker, last night, in a dramatic flourish worthy of the best thespians from the Royal Shakespeare Company, the member from Georgetown, from West Bay North, announced his intention to cross the floor and to join the opposition, ostensibly because of his opposition to the government's policy to build the cruise and expanded cargo port. Mr. Speaker, in the course of the speech he made, which preceded his departure from the government benches, he urged me as Premier to release my cabinet from collective responsibility in support of the bill before the House. Mr. Speaker, the bill before the House has as its long title, "A Bill for a Law to Provide for the Holding of a People-Initiated Referendum on the Issue of Whether the Islands Should Continue to Move Forward with the Building of the Cruise Berthing and Enhanced Cargo Port Facility and for Incidental and Connected Purposes." For emphasis, Mr. Speaker, I will repeat the first line. A bill for a law to provide for the holding of a people-initiated referendum. Mr. Speaker, the ability for the people, the registered electors, to call for, as they have done, and to require that a people-initiated referendum be held derives from the provision in the Constitution contained in Section 70, which, Mr. Speaker, for completeness and hopefully for edification, with your permission, I will read. Section 71 provides, without prejudice to Section 69. Section 69 is essentially the government-initiated referendum provision. A law enacted by the legislature, shall make provision to hold a referendum amongst persons registered as electors in accordance with Section 90 on a matter or matters of national importance that do not contravene any part of the Bill of Rights or any other part of this Constitution. Subsection 2 provides, before a referendum on this section may be held, A, there shall be presented to the Cabinet a petition signed by not less than 25% of persons registered as electors in accordance with Section 90. B, the Cabinet shall settle the wording of a referendum question or questions within a reasonable time period as prescribed by law. And C, the Cabinet shall make a determination on the date the referendum shall be held in a manner prescribed by law. And 3, subject to this Constitution, a referendum under this section shall be binding on the government and the legislature if assented to by more than 50% of persons registered as electors in accordance with Section 90. Mr. Speaker, I have taken the time to read all of that, to say to the member from Georgetown North, West Bay North, and this entire House, and more broadly, the country, that if this legislature fails to pass the bill currently before the House, there is no basis for the holding of a referendum. The Cabinet would have discharged its responsibility by accepting the petition, working out the terms of the question and the date, and bringing the bill to this House. I hear, Mr. Speaker, as I hear a lot of things, rumblings on the other side that some of them may decide not to vote for the bill. Some may abstain. Some may vote no. That is entirely their democratic right. But be it understood by all that a failure to support this bill is a vote against the holding of a people's initiated referendum. So I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, what the member for West Bay North was scolding me about. We, Mr. Speaker, have brought the bill. Every member of the government and the government's backbench who have spoken in support of the bill. But, Mr. Speaker, just to make it absolutely clear, I, as Premier, here and now, release my cabinet from the provisions of collective responsibility and allow them to vote however they wish with respect to this bill. We shall see in due course who in this House truly supports the holding of a referendum initiated by the people, by a petition of the people. Mr. Speaker, the government policy articulated not in one manifesto, but in two, not through one election cycle, but two, has been for at least 6 years to build a cruise and enhanced cargo port. Anyone who paid attention to the process could not have failed to miss that the government was intent on doing this. It has been carried over from the previous administration. Immense amount of work was done then into this administration. So I doubt anyone can truthfully say that they were and have been unaware that this was a key plank of the government's policy platform. Now, Mr. Speaker, a not insignificant number of people plainly disagree. That's why the petition, albeit it took a while, but has garnered the support it has and has allowed it to come here. Mr. Speaker, I have absolutely no argument with that. Mr. Speaker, you know, because you and I were on opposite sides of the table, you know how hard I personally battled for that provision to be in our Constitution. Not everybody agreed. I, Mr. Speaker, hold fast that a democratic system, as messy as it can be, is the best form of administration known to man. And when I say messy, Mr. Speaker, just look what's happened in the UK. And it's happening in the UK. But the democratic system is working. It is working. And on the 12th of December, there'll be an election, and then we'll see what happens. But that's how a democracy works. So, Mr. Speaker, these things tend to be very divisive. I have been deeply saddened, as I'm sure have many, at some of the exchanges and the dialogues and the hate speech that particularly appears regularly on CNS. But that's not just in relation to the issue about the port. The people who seem to post on CNS seem to hate Cayman and Caymanians with an increasing passion. It is very, very worrying. And not just me, everywhere I go, people talk about it. So, Mr. Speaker, just because I and the government I lead support a particular policy position does not mean that we are traitors to some cause, that we hate the environment. It does not mean, Mr. Speaker, that people who support what we are doing ought to be subjected on radio shows by leaders of the CPR to being called pigeons, stool pigeons, Kool-Aid drinkers, uneducated. Mr. Speaker,
Don't forget that I have best seat in the House. Push your seat, right? They need to be seated for a while and see how pushy this is.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't been around quite as long as you, but the 6th of next month, 8th of next month, next Friday, will be 19 years since I was first elected. I have succeeded in 5 election campaigns. I have fought more than my share of battles, politically speaking. I am used, Mr. Speaker, to criticism and to being beaten about the ears and worse. It's part and parcel of this life that we, and I in particular, have chosen. Mr. Speaker, as I've grown older, people who pay attention would notice how little I engage, particularly on the talk shows, because, Mr. Speaker, I have a job to do, and people who want to say what they want to say are free to say it. But, Mr. Speaker, I draw the line. I honestly draw the line. When someone who has been convicted of dishonesty and permanently disqualified from standing for election will go on a talk show and call me and the Deputy Premier, corrupt? Really, Mr. Speaker? I draw the line, Mr. Speaker, when another key leader of CPR, who, as you know as well as I do, was engaged in the tender process for the port in 2012, and who turned up on my porch to complain because they didn't get the contract, will pretend to this country that he is some environmentalist who is vehemently opposed to the port. You know why he's opposed to the port? Because he and his father haven't got the contract. Mr. Speaker, that's where I draw the line. Mr. Speaker, anybody is entitled to their view and their opinion. Anybody is entitled to say they want a piece of this project. But don't go about pretending like that this is a terrible idea, where Alden McLaughlin is a tyrant, Alden McLaughlin is an arrogant so-and-so, Alden McLaughlin is an idiot. I'm determined and intent to destroy my country. Let me tell you something, Mr. Speaker. There may be people in this House, there may be people in this country who love this country as much as I, but I promise you, Mr. Speaker, nobody loves it more. I do not wear my heart on my sleeve, and I don't make many emotional speeches. But, Mr. Speaker, I have done what I've done to this point in my life because of my undying passion and love for this place I call home. Mr. Speaker, I don't always get it right, and I rub some people the wrong way. That is fine. But the reason I am convinced that I have survived this long in politics is because the people who I represent understand that for all his faults, Alden McLaughlin loves this country, he cares about it, and he will do everything in his power to make it better. That's why I am here still, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have nothing more to prove in terms of climbing the political hierarchy. I am Premier for the second time. After that, it is the graveyard you go. Mr. Speaker, I have had, and I still have, zero interest in serving long periods of time to say I'm the one who's been here the longest. What I've always cared about is what I am able to achieve for my country in the time that I am allotted. Mr. Speaker, 19 years of my life have gone by so quickly. I look at my sons, 27 and 24, and I said, geez, where did the years go? I missed so much of their growing up because of this. Mr. Speaker, I have no interest in beating my life out on the opposition benches, complaining and criticizing about what a government is doing or not. My ambition always was to be in a position where I could help to shape the future of this country. And Mr. Speaker, that is why, as criticized as I have been and still are, for forming with you this coalition government. Mr. Speaker, anyone that knows me should know that I harbor no grudges, I hold no ill will. Believe you me, I will remember what you did or didn't do, because I'd be a fool not to. But Mr. Speaker, I carry no weight of hate or anger on my shoulders. When I put my head down in the night, the only thing keep me up will be worrying about what the next issue is that I have to deal with. Not about anything else. Mr. Speaker, I am a pragmatist to my core. Politics is the art of the possible. Sitting over there, as my good friend, the leader of the opposition, does, for 3 consecutive terms, wandering in the political wilderness, achieving zero for his country and his district, is not the fate that I ever wanted for myself. Aside from a difficulty with simple arithmetic, not understanding that himself and the member from Northside alone could not form a government in 2013, or in 2017, that 5 of them could not a majority make. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition is a good and decent man. He has been my friend for many years, despite the licks that he has given me and my vain attempts usually to return a few. But Mr. Speaker, we choose our lot in life and where we want to be. Mr. Speaker, I know, as you do, not sure everybody else does, that it is our obligation when an election is over, and the people have spoken, to try to give the country the best government we can from those who have been elected. We don't get to go and say, oh, I'd rather somebody else. That's who the people have chosen. And that, Mr. Speaker, is how we have been able to form this coalition government. Mr. Speaker, it is not just about forming a government. This is the 3rd I've been in. It is about forming a government that is able to get things done. People elect us to improve their quality of life and to move the country forward. The average person could care less about the internal politics. Their question, and the question each of us have to answer every time we go to the polls, for them is, has he or she made my life better? Has he or she improved the lot of this country? That's what people ask. Believe you me, they do. And those who survive consecutive election cycles are those who receive, for whom the question is answered positively by the voter. Mr. Speaker, we were not elected in here to spend time going to law school. We were elected, Mr. Speaker, to represent the interest of our people. We were not elected in here to spend time on Facebook slagging off this one, that one, and the other one. Remember I say this, there are good many faces I look around here that unless they change their ways, they won't be here next time round. We got one wall on the back here, Mr. Speaker. You'll count the number of one-term politicians on that. You will understand that people who do not realize what their function here is wind up on that wall. Mr. Speaker, this is a divisive project. Mr. Speaker, truthfully, tell you this truthfully, Mr. Speaker. Had we believed that this would be this controversial, the government would not have proceeded with it in 2013. But, Mr. Speaker, we are where we're at. And we are now at a position, having spent more than $5 million in 6.5 years, not counting the work that you did during your administration on it. We are where we are. This referendum, Mr. Speaker, will allow the people of this country who are registered voters, whose names appear on the official list of registered voters, to decide whether this project goes ahead or whether it doesn't. People who are opposed to this feel passionately, many of them, passionately about it. And they are entitled to do so, Mr. Speaker. But in the almost 7 weeks that we have before the referendum is held on the 19th of December, I urge us all, Mr. Speaker, not to become so personal about these things, not to call each other these names of pigeons and stewed pigeons and uneducated and Kool-Aid drinkers and worse. We are one country, one people, all Caymanians, and there are many other people here who are not Caymanians who can't vote, but who have a vested interest and feel strongly about these issues too. Let's be respectful to everyone. I promise the country this. In the same way that the government has scrupulously followed the Constitution with respect to the management of this, so far, when the result is known, if the result is that more than 50% of the registered electors say no to the project, it is dead. It is dead. As much as I and my government think that that would be a huge mistake, that would be the will of the people. And that is what, Mr. Speaker, we will respect. Mr. Speaker, this debate has involved not just the process and concerns and criticisms about the process that's been followed, issues within the bill, but more broadly, whether or not this is a good project for the Cayman Islands. And that is not only entirely permissible and expected, Mr. Speaker, but I think it is the right thing to do. It gives and has given the country the opportunity to hear what the views of the elected members think. A broad cross-section. I think there was only one member who has not spoken. Mr. Speaker, that's all well and good. But I come back to the point I started with, which is what we are being asked to do today is not to vote yes or no for whether the cruise port and cargo project proceeds, but to vote for the vehicle which will allow the referendum, the people-initiated referendum, to be held with respect to that. So if members in this House vote no to the bill, they are voting to prevent the referendum from being held. Mr. Speaker, I listened very carefully to what the opposition had to say about the bill, and indeed what they had to say about the project. I listened hard and long, Mr. Speaker, to try to discern where they stood with respect to the project. Mr. Speaker, I have to say that with the exception of the member from Northside, I and the country are none the wiser as to where the members of the opposition stand with respect to this project. They have demonstrated one thing, Mr. Speaker. They have demonstrated that they have...
Honorable Premier,
Mr. Speaker,
Honorable Member from Georgetown Central, do you have a point of order?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I think it's inappropriate that the Premier...
Can you state the point of order?
Elucidating the House, Mr. Speaker.
I'm not
misleading the House by suggesting that he knows exactly what the country has interpreted. Now, if he has interpreted based on himself what we say, but he can't say the rest of the country has not having a clear picture. Because many people that have seen my speech told me they know exactly where I stand. So I think it's unfair for him to assume on behalf of the rest of the country.
Honorable Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me amend what I said. In my opinion, neither I nor anyone in the country, save the discreet few who have the confidence of the member from Georgetown Central, are any the wiser as to where they stand on this matter. Mr. Speaker, what the members of the opposition, leaving aside the member from Northside, have demonstrated is an incredible skill in balancing and on a very, very narrow fence, so that depending on which way they feel the wind's blowing, they can determine their trajectory. Mr. Speaker, there was the very telling position articulated by both the member from Georgetown Central and the member from Newlands, in which, the member from Bontown West, I think, in which they said, and this was part of their argument for why there should be a constituency by constituency count for the referendum and not a national count. They want to know, they say, how their constituents have voted, and if it is determined that their constituents voted yes for the port, they'll pick up the shovels and go down there and start digging. Now, Mr. Speaker, that sounds very good. But when you subject it to any kind of analysis, you see how fallacious it really is. Mr. Speaker, we are elected to represent. But represent means leadership as well. Mr. Speaker, if the majority of people have voted no, it is rather late for the members to decide that's the position they're going to take.
Member from Bordentown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just, I think the Premier is,
Do you have a point of order?
yes, I do. I think the Premier is, was misleading or misunderstood what it was I said, because what I also indicated, which he conveniently left out, if it gets approval, is that by not showing also how the vote count went, his own members are also in the dark. And I think I also alluded to the fact that that was being done to make sure to keep them in line also. So if he's going to put what it is I was speaking about, and he needs to put everything in its full context, not just part of it, because he needs them in the dark too to keep them in line.
We take that as an explanation.
Yes, sir. That's all right. I thank the member for the clarification. Mr. Speaker, that might appear to be a convenient ploy, but it is, Mr. Speaker, in reality, an act of political cowardice and demonstrates a real lack of leadership. At least we know where the member from North Side stands, and we can't paint him with that brush. Mr. Speaker, he has always, the member from North Side, been against the cruise port, and indeed the enhanced cargo port. As long as I have been here with him these past 6.5 years, that has been his position. I disagree fundamentally with the premise of, or premises of his objection, but I respect the fact that I know where, and the country knows where he stands. This nice dance that the opposition have done and are doing does, Mr. Speaker, a real disservice to their role as proper representatives. It's only been, Mr. Speaker, in the last few months that a number of them, notably not the leader of the opposition, but a number of them have decided to hitch their wagons to this train, this CPR-led train, because they think, Mr. Speaker, it is going to reach a particular station. But, Mr. Speaker, we shall see. That is my view. The judgment is not mine to make. The final judgment is not mine to make. It's them that have to face their electorate. Mr. Speaker, everybody knows what my position is, Mr. Deputy Leader. By contrast, Mr. Speaker, contrast to the position of the member from North Side, the leader of the opposition spent a lot of time while he was on his feet commenting on a great many things, but little really addressing the issues before us with the referendum bill and the cruise and cargo port. He rambled and he weaved so much that I was reminded of the quote from Alice in Wonderland, where Alice asked the Cheshire Cat, "Which way do I go?" The cat replied, "That depends on where you're going." "I do not know," said Alice. The grinning cat wisely responded, "Then it does not matter which way you go." That, Mr. Speaker, was the leader of the opposition. He did not really know where he wanted to take the debate, and so he went everywhere. So much so that he did not even realize that he had run out of time. And you, sir, in your unfailing generosity, had to grant him an extension. But I guess, Mr. Speaker, that is what happens when you have no real objection to the port project. at least none that has been articulated. And just want to try to score a few good political points by speaking to your fans in the gallery and those listening on the radio. The member wants to help, Mr.
The
Speaker.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition, do you have a point of order?
And if my good friend considers it a point of elucidation, then I would.
Make it short, though, no longer to speak.
Okay.
That's allowed as long as
Yeah.
it's
Number
within
one, I'm
reason.
not Alice in Wonderland. And neither am I Steel Darker running down the road with the tail hanging out behind him either, hitched on to me. Nothing is hitched on to me, as he so eloquently explained. You remember the Steel Darker song? Mr. Speaker, the
I
Premier
don't.
is trying to infer that the country does not know where I'm at. At least he doesn't. I suspect it's those speechwriters who were listening and not him. Mr. Speaker, I have said on numerous times, and I said it again recently in here, that there are different methods I cannot support based on my experience what the government is proposing to do out there. I invited the country to wrap it up, wrap the no up in swaddling clothes and present it to him on Christmas. I have said on the radio and here that I will be voting no against the dock as proposed. Do I need to make myself any clearer, my friend?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for finally making us aware of what his position is. Mr. Speaker, in attempting to score his political points, the Leader of the Opposition spent a lot of time reminding the country about the fact that you and I have had our share of political differences in the past. Mr. Speaker, I don't know that the country really needs much reminder of that. We all know that history well. Mr. Speaker, he spent some time reading from the considered position of the opposition at the time, which I led and of which he was a member. Mr. Speaker, he also read from a press release that we had issued following the outcome of the referendum on one person, one vote. And again, Mr. Speaker, I do not resile one moment from what I said in any of those pieces of correspondence. Mr. Speaker, but what you and I and the country also knows well, as he does, is that despite our political differences over the many years, we have always been able to find ways to work together for the benefit of the country, and that continues through to today. Otherwise, Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't be Premier and you wouldn't be Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there have been many on the various radio shows and on the social media commenting negatively that you and I and our respective political parties have been able to put together with some independence this government of national unity. But what the naysayers don't seem to understand, as I said earlier, is in the aftermath of an election, it is the duty of those who have been elected to put together the best government you possibly can. And Mr. Speaker, despite the early hiccups that we had in trying to form the government, I have to say the government has worked very well these past 2 years, almost 2 years and a half. And not only worked well together, we have achieved and are achieving many very good things for this country. Mr. Speaker, we have demonstrated, even with with the departure last night of the member from West Bay North, who quite frankly has never engaged with the government since it was formed. Despite that, we have demonstrated, Mr. Speaker, that we have the ability to work together and, importantly, to stay together. When you are dealing with a coalition government, Mr. Speaker, that is not always an easy thing to do. And anyone who thinks that the 6.5 years that I have been Premier has been a bed of roses really don't begin to understand what it takes to bring a group of people together, hold them together, build consensus, and get things done for your people. Mr. Speaker, I have heard the leader of the CPR that I referred to earlier describe me on a talk show as a tyrant. Ask any of these people around here, at the back of me and alongside me, how much of a tyrant I am. If I was the tyrant that he is, this would not have lasted a dog watch. Mr. Speaker, it is about building consensus, valuing the contributions of every member of the team, taking them on board, being prepared to have your own views taken apart. And other people say to you, Premier, I hear what you say, but we can't agree to that. And accept it. That's why I'm still here, Mr. Speaker. Ask any of them for their testimony. Mr. Speaker, can't say that about the opposition. My dear friend, the member from Northside, he went inside the kitchen to get a cup of coffee, and when he came back, he had lost his seat. Mr. Speaker, it will be interesting to see how long the official opposition remains together. I see the member from Georgetown Central out there doing his own things on the side. We'll see. I'll tell you this, Mr. Speaker. If you can't keep a group of people together in the opposition, God help you if you try it over here, where you have real responsibility for decision making and where the decisions you make actually matter, where the decisions you make result sometime in a people-initiated referendum. Serious business. Serious business. Mr. Speaker, in the next, how many months we got left? This is November, December, January, November, December. Mr. Speaker, in the 18 months, 16 months, whatever it is, we got 16 months we got left. I invite this country to listen, to hear what is the roadmap for this country that eclectic group who make up the official opposition have planned. Mr. Speaker, the deputy leader of the opposition is saying I act like I was never over there. Mr. Speaker, that's where I understood what it takes. Mr. Speaker, you know because you were on the other side. Mr. Speaker, I spent 3 of my first 4 years in opposition. I spent the next 4 years in 3.5 years because we had Hurricane Ivan. 4 years in government, 4 years in opposition, and now 4 years in government, and now in my 5th term. Mr. Speaker, I understand very well the challenges of being in opposition, but I've always understood, even in my harshest criticism of your good self and your government, that if we wanted to replace you and your government, if we believe that we could do a better job, we had to do more than criticize. We had to show to the country that we had a plan and we had the people who could execute the plan and persuade them to vote that way. What is the country hearing from the opposition? Nothing but rancor, discord, and criticism. Ask their constituents, not all of them, but some of them, how much they think the elected members of the opposition are doing for them. I know because I asked them. Mr. Speaker, the opposition job I respect. It is not opposition's job to agree with everything the government does. But it's also not the opposition's job to oppose everything the government does simply because it's the government who's doing it. If you think we can do it better, that should be your proposal. If you have an alternative, that should be your proposal. What have you heard about the cruise and cargo port? Nothing but prophecies of doom and gloom. Mr. Speaker, when we took office 6.5 years ago, unemployment in this country was at 10.5%. Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Tourism and the then Councillor, who is now Minister for Infrastructure and Commerce, and myself in particular, delegations of people from the taxis, from the cruise tour operators, even, Mr. Speaker, completely unrelated to this, or perhaps not completely, but mostly unrelated to this, quarry operators, developers. Mr. Premier, you got to do something. We're losing our businesses. Mr. Speaker, those first 3 years, the hardest years of my life, I despaired. No matter what we seemed to do, although some of the key indicators were pointing in the right direction, we simply couldn't seem to get past this unemployment issue. The member from Georgetown Central, the member from Newlands in particular, and to a lesser extent, the member from Bordentown West, down here with motions calling for some various forms of relief for people who are unemployed, save people houses, change pension provisions in the law, hammering us constantly, Mr. Speaker, about what we're doing for our people. Mr. Speaker, we had a plan and we executed it. They hammered us about giving concessions to developers. Mr. Speaker, those concessions are what kick-started the economy in the aftermath of the 2008 recession. You ask any developer how many concessions they get from us now. We don't need it, Mr. Speaker. My point, Mr. Speaker, is that the opposition just zooms in on a particular issue, make no connection between what they are objecting to and the broader economic picture. God help this country if they were in charge of directing this economy. Mr. Speaker, these things are all connected. I cannot believe, Mr. Speaker, having been subjected to these years of hammering and criticism about jobs for Caymanians by the member for Georgetown Central, the member from Newlands, and more recently, the member from Bordentown West. Hammering that they can be so flippant, about the jobs of the 4,500 plus people who are engaged in the cruise industry. Absolutely flippant. They don't matter. Mr. Speaker, how can you on the one hand claim that you are the voice of the voiceless, help for the helpless, you are the one who's going to continue to hammer for jobs for your Caymanians, and you're at risk of losing 4,500 of them, and it don't matter? Because nothing they have said, Mr. Speaker, nothing they have said in criticism of this addresses what are you going to do? What is the country going to do? When, as is inevitable, the number of cruise visitors shrinks. What are the alternatives? The Minister for Infrastructure and Commerce put it the best I've ever heard it put the other night. Not the other night, it seems so long ago, last night. He said, Mr. Speaker, Cayman's choice is to decide whether we want to remain in the cruise business or not. That is the big decision that we have to take. It is entirely up to us if we say, as it seems to be suggested by the member from Bordentown West, that the way to go is stay over tourism. If we make that choice, and that sounds to be the choice that he would make were he over on the side, what are you going to do to ensure that those who have lost their jobs have jobs? It's not a simple exercise of swapping one for the other. Mr. Speaker, stay over tourism does contribute significantly more to government's bottom line and the economy more broadly than cruise tourism. 650 million compared to an estimated 200 million. So no one is suggesting for a moment on this side that stay over tourism and the impact that cruise numbers have on the experience of stay over visitors isn't important. It is, Mr. Speaker. It's a cause for concern, and it does create a tension. But that aside, you try to determine how many Caymanians are actually involved in stay-over tourism compared to the number in cruise tourism. Almost every person who is engaged directly in cruise tourism is a Caymanian. Almost everyone who is involved directly in stay-over tourism is not a Caymanian. Now, Mr. Speaker, that has been the dilemma for many governments. As long as I've been here, that has been a dilemma. Every government that I've been aware of has really tried to engage more Caymanians in the jobs in stay-over tourism. But none of us, despite all the great efforts made and some successes shown under the leadership of the Deputy Premier, none of us can say honestly that it has been a rip-roaring success. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to get the balance right, without a question. But this attitude that, and I've seen it not only here, I've read it on various posts and so forth, we should just do away with the cruise visitors. All they're doing is getting in the way of the stay-over tourism, various things like that. Mr. Speaker, that is not the position this government takes. We do not think it is viable. We think that there has to be a proper balance struck. Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Premier was at pains yesterday to say, listen, if the cruise port is built, if the berthings are built, we will be capable of managing across that berthing 2.5 million cruise passengers a year, up from the 1.8 it is 1.8 now. But he was also at pains to point out that we are not victims of this business. We are beneficiaries. And, Mr. Speaker, we are in control of our own destiny. The port, the cruise berthings will be managed, continue to be managed by the Port Authority. We are able, Mr. Speaker, through them, to set the numbers. No one is expecting that when the cruise port is completed, assuming it is built, 3 years or so from now, that we will automatically zoom from 1.8 to 2.5 million cruise passengers. Mr. Speaker, what it will allow us to do in a way that is not possible now, because the cruise companies will not agree to tender the big ships which pass us by in the summer, is to spread, or to use the industry term, flatten out the numbers so that it is not just the high season that we wind up with 24,000, 25,000 and requests for more cruise passengers in one day. But we were able to spread the numbers over what have been the traditionally slow months. We were able to manage the numbers better. We were able to provide a more consistent revenue stream to those who are engaged in the cruise business. Mr. Speaker, all of the reports indicate, and anecdotal evidence makes it clear, that Cayman needs to provide more in terms of attractions. We need to do that. We all are aware of the strains on infrastructure, particularly road systems. We are working, Mr. Speaker. Lord knows we are working as hard as we can to address particularly the road system issues. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is given the state of the economy, Cayman's population has increased. The resident population has increased by more than 12,000 people since we took office, or certainly I, as Premier, took office 6.5 years ago. Mr. Speaker, that is a sign of growth. Whenever we have these growth spurts, it creates significant stress on infrastructure and social issues as well. I've lived long enough to have lived through a number of them. And we have to manage growth, Mr. Speaker. But this much I know. I have also lived long enough to know that any time the economy slows down in any significant way, we have significant unemployment, and we have real social issues. We have increased crime. Mr. Speaker, not everyone subscribes to my view about this, and I'm not expecting everyone to, but I am telling you, I have studied enough of societies across the world to understand that when a society stops growing, it starts dying. Believe me when I tell you that. Those who suggest that we can be insular, that there is some tap over there that we can just turn off, we've had enough now, and everything is just going to continue in Cayman perfectly fine. I hear the member from Bordentown West suggesting essentially that, this is, if it works, don't fix it. Cayman is a unique place, and we just have to preserve the status quo, and all will be well. Mr. Speaker, he may be a good accountant, but I wouldn't want him to manage my business. Mr. Speaker, if we are not growing, we are dying. We have to do what we need to do to build the infrastructure to support the growth, continued growth of these industries. Mr. Speaker, I heard the member from West Bay North talk about his children with passion, even tears. Mr. Speaker, I have children too. I love them too. Anyone who thinks that I don't want this place to be somewhere that they continue to be proud of and where they have opportunity, don't begin to know anything about me. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, they paint us on this side over here as some kind of tyrants who don't live in the real Cayman, don't understand what the issues are that the average person is facing. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this. I move all over this little country in all kinds of diggings, if you want to call them that, where people say I shouldn't go because the premier may be at risk. It ain't no one in here that knows any more about the social challenges in this country than I do. They may know as much. There's no part that I don't go. I listen to people all over the place talk to me. And Mr. Speaker, I do not only have the perspective of the privileged, I understand what the average person out there is struggling with. That, Mr. Speaker, is why I believe that the no vote will fail to get 50% plus one. Because when I talk to the average Caymanian who struggles, when I talk to the people who make a living from the cruise business, when I talk to the people who hope to get good jobs during the construction and who will be able to provide additional services, and the people in the restaurants, those are the people who tell me it is all well and good for those in CPR who live their daily lives in air-conditioned offices to say what they say. They don't understand. They don't feel what we feel when we struggle to make it from day to day. Mr. Speaker, I represent a constituency where I got an overwhelming support, even though there were two people running against me. Mr. Speaker, 36% of that electorate, which is about 1,000 people. No, yeah, about 1,000 people. Only 880 something came out to vote, but about 1,000 people signed the petition. Does anybody believe that I don't understand that that is a significant number? But I also know that is not the majority. And Mr. Speaker, any of my constituents who have written me, I have responded to explain to them why the government takes the position that I did. Aside from the fact that it was in our campaign manifesto, clear as day. Mr. Speaker, I respect their views, as I must. But I am their representative, and I must demonstrate leadership, and I must also, Mr. Speaker, honor promises I made in an election campaign. If, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the process, the majority of the country votes the project down, then, Mr. Speaker, I would have gotten it wrong. The people would have decided, but I would have discharged my responsibility. I've seen recently, this morning, an email from one of the CPR people to one of my members complaining about, and I got one from one of my constituents as well, that we are angry at the people who signed the petition. No, Mr. Speaker, not at all. I am angry at certain of the CPR key players who consistently malign myself and my character. And it's difficult for me to forgive that. because I haven't done them anything personally. Right. But, Mr. Speaker, as I said at the start, the process is the democratic process. We are here to give the people a chance. I argue your case as strongly as you can, and the result will come out at the other end. But let us not forget that we are, as I said, one people, one country. Whatever the result, we all have to continue to live here and to live together. Let us not forget that. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we will deliver to the country the budget for the last year and a half of our term on next week, Friday. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am not going to spend a great deal of time on the economic issues that the country and the world are facing today. I can promise the country we are going to deliver an excellent budget. I have been around a while, delivered quite a few budgets. This is as good as it gets, Mr. Speaker. I don't mean just the bottom line numbers. I mean in terms of what we are going to be able to deliver for people, particularly the most vulnerable in this community. But, Mr. Speaker, there are worrying signs. There are worrying signs. I said with a great deal of pride a little while ago what we've been able to do in terms of Caymanian unemployment since we took office. But all the signs say that the global growth is going to slow significantly. That's what the optimists say. The pessimists say we're headed for another recession in a year or so. Anyone who believes, as some in the opposition seem to do, that Cayman is somehow insulated from the impacts of global shocks is dreaming in color, Mr. Speaker. They do not seem to appreciate that virtually everything that happens here in terms of economic activity has as its driver inward investment. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, they can be glib on the other side because they have no responsibility. We have the responsibility, Mr. Speaker. We have the responsibility. Mr. Speaker, I just want to get the date of this. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, October 29th, from the Gleaner, the Jamaica Gleaner, IMF warns of economic growth slowdown in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is from Washington, Mr. Speaker. The International Monetary Fund says growth in Latin America and the Caribbean is slowing down and that the region is expected to record a 0.2% growth this year. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to go into all of the various bits in it because it's got country by country in the Caribbean. It doesn't talk about Cayman, but it's got a whole lot of them, including Jamaica, Bahamas, Trinidad, a whole range of them. We'll deal with all of this in more detail, Mr. Speaker, next week. But the point I'm making, Mr. Speaker, is that because we are doing so well, because the gravy train is running, it is so easy to become complacent and to believe that things, as the member from Bordentown West suggested, will continue as they are if you all just stay out of the way. Mr. Speaker, the member from Bordentown West seems to believe that we have arrived at this particular place with the economy overall, but in particular with respect to the tourist industry, by chance. This just happens by default. If he only begun...
Mr. Speaker, point
Oh,
out.
Mr. Speaker, he's becoming tiresome now.
No. No.
What's the point of order?
No, the point of order is that he's indicating or misleading that I'm believing that the tourism success was by chance. No, it started from under your when you were Minister of Tourism and the foundation that you laid down. That's where it started from, and that's what I've always said.
I'm very, very happy for the accolades that I'm getting, but try don't involve me, no?
Mr. Speaker, this is the result of an incredible amount of thought and vision by the Minister for Tourism, the Deputy Premier, and his team. Mr. Speaker, they tried to take him and make him president of the Caribbean Tourism Association. I said, no way. As much as I want to help the Caribbean, we got to look out for right here. Mr. Speaker, that is how much he is, how well he is thought of right across the Caribbean, how much he is admired for what he has been able to do in 6.5 years. Mr. Speaker, I want to finish up by dealing with, again, or underlining some of the key points, and hopefully further debunking some of the myths and arguments that we hear about this project. Mr. Speaker, I will start with the financing. Mr. Speaker, it is a fallacy that the government or the Caymanian people will be paying for this project. We have kept the cost of the project to just under $200 million. Not the $400 million that some in the CPR leadership, and particularly CNS, said would be the cost. And the preferred bidder was not China Harbor, as some in the CPR leadership and CNS insisted it was. Mr. Speaker, Verdant Isle, as we all know, is the entity chosen as the preferred bidder of the project. It is they who will carry all the risks, including the funding for the cruise berthing and enhanced cargo port. They will finance all costs associated with the design, as well as for the building and the maintenance of the port over the next 25 years. Maintenance alone will cost about $75 million a year, and Verdant Isle will be repaid for building and maintaining the port by utilizing part of the money obtained from the cruise passenger tax. This deal to build the cruise berthing and enhanced cargo port not only ensures that no government funding will be used to build the dock, it also ensures that the facilities remain in the ownership of the Cayman Islands. As I've said in my debate, Mr. Speaker, the eventual increase in cruise ship passengers, particularly in the slower cruise season, means that not only will more cruise passengers bring opportunities for Caymanians, but will also grow government revenues, thus making more money available to pay for schools, scholarship, security, healthcare, and infrastructure projects like roads and a myriad of other services that government provides to the people of these islands. Mr. Speaker, on the environmental front, we have responded to people's environmental concerns and significantly reduced the environmental impacts of the project by ensuring there will be no dredging in Hogstye Bay and no risk to 7 Mile Beach. We have committed to relocating coral, and we do believe that we can become the go-to jurisdiction for other countries that want to learn how to successfully relocate coral. Our goal all along has been and remains to safeguard Cayman's economic future while minimizing impact on our environment with the port development. Mr. Speaker, I do hope that when voters go to the polls on the 19th of December, that they will opt to move forward with building our new cruise berthing and enhanced cargo facilities, helping guarantee that cruise ships will continue to bring us visitors. By making the right choice, existing jobs will be kept safe and more employment and business opportunities will be available for Caymanians. An enhanced cargo facility can help government drive down the cost of the goods imported to all 3 of our islands because bigger ships with more cargo will be able to dock here. We have outgrown our cargo facilities, and tying in the development of all enhanced cargo port of an enhanced cargo port with the cruise berthing facility just makes good economic sense. Mr. Speaker, as I said when I introduced this bill, we should all be choosing prosperity. If we don't, Caymanians will lose jobs, their businesses will fail, the cost of goods imported to our country will go up as our population grows. If we don't choose prosperity, we choose decline. Mr. Speaker, as for me and the government I have the honor to lead, we choose prosperity for today and for the future. We have to move forward with building the cruise berthing and enhanced cargo facilities to help secure our future prosperity. Mr. Speaker, once again, I ask all members of this Honorable House to vote aye to this referendum bill. That those Caymanians who go out to the polls on referendum day vote a resounding yes to the question: should the Cayman Islands continue to move forward with building the cruise berthing and enhanced cargo port facility? Mr. Speaker, I thank the House for their attention.